Thank you, Rowan. Welcome everybody to the next session. This time we're welcoming another Legalise Cannabis MP. This time Rachel Payne from Victoria.
Hello.
Woo! Yeah, definitely another one of our politician superstars, so thanks for coming to support her. And Rachel's going to talk on, actually, you know, not specifically political, which is fantastic. Rachel's going to be talking about women and weed, the power and pain of femininity. And in this presentation, Rachel's going to explore the therapeutic benefits that cannabis provides for women and how this is reflected in current trends. Rachel was first elected to the upper house in Victoria in 2022 when Legalise Cannabis gained its first 2 seats. So David Ettershank, your partner in crime, cannabis crime, David will be speaking as well this weekend. He will be in Indica Arena tent, and he'll be speaking with Jeremy Buckingham as well. So I told you that we're working Jeremy really hard. It was last year it was Dr. Brian Walker from Legalise Cannabis, who we flogged senseless.
We joked with Jeremy last night that he's on stage 68 times.
Whoa,
68 is
okay.
an exaggeration.
But it's people that love talking, right? So we watch out for them and make good use of them. So I was going to say, and Rachel, of course, her focus in Parliament is on progressive cannabis law reform, harm minimisation and protecting the rights of cannabis consumers. So thank you very much for coming to Nimbin, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we're on a Bundjalung land and acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. I like to come up to Nimbin a couple of times a year, and it's such a beautiful spiritual place and there's such connection here, so I'd just like to pay my deepest respects. So today I wanted to talk about women and weed. As someone who consumes cannabis and has done my whole adult life, it wasn't until I became an elected member of Parliament and more women were coming to me and telling me of their stories of being cannabis users, and it almost felt like there was this emergence of coming out as a cannabis user, which I found really fascinating because for me, there's such a symbiotic relationship between women and the way that we consume cannabis and for reasons why we consume cannabis. And I know for myself personally, it's a therapeutic experience for me. It is a spiritual experience. And I mean, when I met my girlfriend and she had a weed leaf tattooed on her ass cheek, I knew that she was my darling, you know. So when I think about some of the stories that I've heard from other women, this is what inspired me to sort of give this talk, and it made me curious about, is the data sort of showing that? Are we seeing emergence in women accessing cannabis more? And I got curious, I suppose, and this is coming to you from a position of someone who supports cannabis reform and is an advocate in that space, and I have the privilege of being a member of Parliament representing cannabis in Parliament. But it's also as a woman who consumes cannabis and has done for a long time, and the reasoning behind my use is I do get anxiety. I find it is something that really alleviates that. It allows me to be at peace with my mind, sleep. I also use it for period pain, and this is some of the patterns and trends that I was hearing from other women. So I wanted to delve into that with you all and I guess open it up for a conversation as well. I think one of the funniest things, though, I've heard of some of the stories that women do share with me about cannabis use is I had quite a few women approaching me who grow their own cannabis, and they talk about they use their moon cup and dilute their menstrual blood and fertilise their plants. And I thought, wow, now that's a real connection with your plant, isn't it? So I really have enjoyed some of those incredible stories that have come through. But why don't we look at some of the data? And, what we're going to look at today is medicinal cannabis prescriptions, because we do have more data around that, around the SASB prescriptions. And what we have found is that when it comes to approvals, the rates of prescription are going up. So in February of this year, it was 12,301 applications, a 16% increase since January. Now that's the national numbers. And the overall gender split is 60% men prescribed and 40% women. And now we are seeing that each month that is increasing for women's use. And how we're consuming cannabis was an interesting one for me when it comes to what is prescribed medicinally. And I also want to acknowledge that being prescribed medicinally, legally, is a real privilege as well, because you've got to be able to afford that. In comparison, I know a lot of people who treat themselves and use cannabis therapeutically, and they obviously either grow their own or they access it through the illicit market. But what we found just from the data when it comes to medicinal cannabis patients was that the majority of patients are still consuming through oral solutions. Then it's 37% is through flower, 8% through pastilles, and then the remaining 3% is, say, capsules and things like that. Now, I find that really interesting because I think one of the biggest deterrents for women accessing cannabis medicinally has been, oh, I don't want to smoke a joint. I mean, I love smoking joints, but I know a lot of people don't like to inhale. Whereas what we're seeing here is that the oral solutions is by far the most accessed medicinal prescribed medicine. And then when we have a look at why people are accessing medicinal cannabis and what their prescriptions are filling, it's for chronic pain, anxiety, sleep disorder were the most common, and then followed by things like depression, PTSD, and ADHD. Now, when we break it down again into that gender portfolio, obviously both men and women experience these symptoms. But when it comes to under the categorisation of chronic pain, I would consider endometriosis falling under that capture. And so today I wanted to actually focus a little bit on endometriosis and what I'm hearing anecdotally from people who are using cannabis therapeutically, but also what we're seeing in the science and what's coming out of the research. I love this quote because it really summarises some of the amazing research and work that's going into this space, but also the capacity of cannabis to be multifactional in approach. So the health of women and those assigned female at birth has multifactorial components, including mood, pain, poor sleep, and/or hormonal dysfunction. The capacity of cannabis to act as an anti-inflammatory agent, a pain reliever, a muscle relaxant, a mood enhancer, a sleep remedy, all at the same time, make it potentially ideal for those facing these particular conditions. And the reason I wanted to highlight that was because those of us who access cannabis know that it has all of those capabilities, but it's not something that those that are not exposed to cannabis completely understand. And when we are talking to people with endometriosis, the reason why it works so effectively is because not only does it help with managing pain, but it also has that ongoing effect of reducing inflammation. And we're also seeing that people are reporting that other medications they may be prescribed, antidepressants, opiate-based pain medications, they're no longer requiring or able to reduce. Now, when you've got something like cannabis that has an incredibly low harm profile in comparison to opiate-based pain medications, then we're really onto something that could be an answer for so many people who have suffered. And those that do experience endometriosis know how long it does take to receive a diagnosis in that space. Just on looking at endometriosis and opiates as the most prescribed treatment for endo, what we're starting to see in some of the data is what they are coining the substitution effect, where in the United States in particular, medicinal cannabis is becoming more and more prevalent for treating endometriosis, and they're seeing a massive decline in women accessing opiate-based medications. They're also seeing a reduction in those that have addiction issues and those that may be impacted through overdose, and the mortality rates are reducing as well, which I found really fascinating. When we've got such an opioid epidemic in the States and there are concern of that potentially coming to Australia, I think we really need to broaden that conversation out around is cannabis something that is more likely to be accessible and reduce harm in this space? Because people use those medications because they are suffering pain. And I know that Jeremy brought that up earlier, and we had a bit of a conversation about how pain is something that we all experience, and it's something where the traditional means of treatment of that are just not effective for a lot of people. So to have that accessibility to cannabis means that more people are living a better and fuller life. These are some of the stories that have come in through, I guess, some of the advocacy work that I have done. When we were last year presenting the bill to regulate personal use of cannabis, what I found most interesting during that debate was that the media started to ask other politicians, and including our Premier, Jacinta Allen, about their cannabis use. And the Premier herself even came out and said, yes, I have tried cannabis. And what we discovered was it was about 2/3 of the members of Parliament in our chambers responded with, oh yes, I've tried it. Now, if that conversation was 5 years ago, they would have been terrified to admit that they had used cannabis. And I found this really fascinating because not only is it that the conversation has changed and the rhetoric has changed, but more people are sort of coming forward and saying, these are things that are effective for me. And I'll just keep flicking through some of these screens. And the Premier herself in Victoria has been quite vocal about the fact that she does suffer endometriosis, she does suffer period pain. And so that's my next mission, is to start getting her to become a medicinal cannabis patient in that space, because I think she would find it would really help her. But just some of these stories sort of really do resonate with me around the fact that there has been years of misdiagnosis or no diagnosis. In this person's case, they had to have surgery. All other medications have either been unaffordable or have not worked. And finally, they get to a point where they've found something that is not only effective, but has lessened symptoms of other ailments, such as depression, mood, anxiety, inflammation and pain. I quite like these two as well, because they do talk about different experiences around not only pain management, but generally nervous system support. And I think that it's also interesting when someone talks about their experiences in their own life and then reflects it on how it may even interact with their work. And I did notice that in what Amelia had written, that they do focus on sexual and reproductive health, and for them to reconsider that cannabis could play a big part in some of the prescribing that they're doing has really given an indicator here. So what are some of the barriers to access? Well, getting a prescription is the main barrier. It's expensive. As someone who is medically prescribed, I was fortunate enough to be able to go through a process where I worked with a doctor and had a prescription. But you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars if you want to continue that avenue. What we're trying to do in Victoria is push forward with personal adult use, meaning you can grow 6 plants, you can share and gift to other people. And we know that that's already going on. So we wanted to make sure that those that are supplying to their friends, their family, their brothers and sisters, that they are supported through better law reform. I guess one of the biggest barriers I've noticed, particularly access for women, is stigma. And I have found since I've been a Member of Parliament and been more vocal about my cannabis use, as I mentioned earlier, I'm finding more people are coming to me and talking about their cannabis use. And I think that by having those broader conversations and opening up those channels for greater dialogue, that we do start to see people think, maybe I could give this a try. And I'm noticing that even in my own friendship circles, people who have always been opposed, had a bad experience as a teenager smoking a joint at a party, never want to be in that mindset ever again, are coming around to the fact that if they are understanding how to use cannabis and what are the effects of that, then they can have a better relationship going forward and use it to their advantage. Obviously, the legalities are a major blockade, and I know particularly for women, one of the major concerns is the driving laws. In Victoria, we have seen that our government has basically kicked the can down the road and offered a driving trial, on-track driving trial. Thankfully, that driving trial is currently on track to be finished by the end of this year, and we do expect that the results will be positive. We just don't know whether we trust the government as yet to follow their own advice because they haven't been that forthcoming in doing that in the last few major reforms around safer access around drugs more generally. And some of the other things that I think had been interesting around looking at the comparisons between the legal medicinal market and those that access it themselves personally through the illicit market is the safety and regulations. And I think that women especially like to have those assurances of what they're putting into their bodies, how much a dose they should be having, the levels of THC, CBD, what the effects are of their terpenes, and that's something that is of benefit when you are prescribed. You can have that conversation and you receive that information. I might just move on to quickly discuss the National Drug Strategy Household Survey was released earlier this year, and it found, I found the reporting towards what the general consensus was that there is starting to become more of a less of a discrepancy between men's and women's use when it comes to all drugs. But when it came to cannabis, the media tended to highlight that women's use had gone up, and they described this as problematic. And this was one of the things that I wanted to talk to you as an audience about. Do we feel that an increase in women accessing cannabis is something that is problematic, or is this just sexist reporting? Because we're still nowhere near the use of men. And why would the media focus on something where we are seeing more women accessing medicinal cannabis through those avenues, but we're also noticing that cannabis more broadly is becoming more widely accepted? I would prefer to have a joint than a drink, and I know a lot of people in that same space. So I would love to have a further chat with you about that, and I would like to open it up for conversation. Thank you. Love to hear from some of the women in the audience as to why you like using cannabis.
Okay, here we go.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Kyla, everyone.
Hey, Kyla.
I use cannabis because I had a shoulder injury years ago and was using opioids. Now, when I went to my doctor and said, I think there's a problem here, like my pain seems to get worse and worse, they just prescribed me more and more. And eventually someone said, try some CBD, and I'm like, I don't think that's going to help me. It's changed my life, completely changed my life. Like I don't, and I don't understand why we don't have, drug testing for that sort of thing. But also going back to alcohol, there are a lot of women in my community who know that I use cannabis, and they come to see me because they're drinking so heavily and they're so sick and they're not able to look after their kids. And, I find that's really sad because they have so much stigma around the cannabis, but alcohol is killing them.
I actually saw a really interesting quote the other day, which was, a mum gets a free pass for having half a bottle of wine, but she gets shade for smoking a joint.
Yeah.
And I thought, how ridiculous is that? Because if you drink half a bottle of wine, as you said, they're struggling to be present with their kids the next day. Whereas if you're smoking a joint, we all know that we have a really good night's sleep and you're feeling amazing the next day.
I'm a better mum. I'm a better mum to my kids. When I'm in pain, I'm an asshole. And cannabis helps me to connect with them, to play with them. I've asked them the question because, I haven't had a drink for 11 years. I would never, ever go back to it. But I say to them, what do you think? And they're like, oh, you're the best. It's the best. You're relaxed, you laugh, you have fun. I can sit there and be present with them. On any of that other stuff, no presence.
I think there was a conversation earlier just around cannabis being seen as a drug. And I think that's, again, that stigmatisation of something that we're all using therapeutically. Talking with a lot of those at the Hemp Embassy, and Michael Balderson and I in particular always refer to the fact that our use is therapeutic. It is. That's why we use it.
Sorry, you have to just wait for the microphone. We're recording, so you're a big black hole if you don't have it. Yeah, and put it near your mouth as well.
I'd forgotten what I was going to say then. All of that was too much. Sorry, I have forgotten. I'll hand it back.
Sorry.
Your story isn't unique, and I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think it's interesting that other women in your community are coming to you and also sharing their experience of what I want the alternative, because the alternative feels a lot safer, not only for me, but for my family. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other comments? Oh, yes, we've got one over there. Here comes the mic.
Thank you. I just wanted to introduce the concept of administration and decoupling this concept. I just caught the end of the talk, by the way, so sorry. Last 5 minutes type of thing. So decoupling the compound from the root of administration. Say that 3 times quickly. So smoking obviously is not condoned or encouraged, and hence you get into the tinctures. So just as a concept, I just wanted to put that out there. So getting people to understand that same compound, different way you're getting it to your body, simple as that. So for someone who thinks smoking, who in their mind associates cannabis medicinally, well, you introduce the concept to them of medicinal cannabis and they think smoking a joint, you want to decouple that and say, well, it's actually just THC, CBD, etc., that you're wanting to somehow imbibe. Yep.
And I think we all understand more about cannabis now, that we do understand CBD and THC are different compounds of the plant, and I think that's really opened up how we navigate through that with our conversations more broadly with community. So there's not someone that doesn't know someone that is not a medicinal cannabis patient, or someone's grandmother who has access to CBD for her arthritis. I helped get the Victorian Party registered, and so I spent a lot of time on the phone speaking with all of our members just to make sure that the letter was coming and we were going to get registered. And I spoke to so many women then in their 80s that grow a couple of plants in the backyard and they make their own butter for their arthritis. I love the fact that we have moved away from just assuming that if you smoke a joint, you're going to be high, and this is the outcome of being a cannabis user. There's so much intertwined in that. Yeah, I'm sorry you missed the first part of the talk because I actually go into looking at prescriptions, and because we have data on that, but having a look at how many people are prescribed oral liquids instead of it's comparative.
I'm privy. I'm privy to some of the economics around medical cannabis in this country.
Totally.
For instance, some of the financials around companies like Montu and Alternaleaf. If you're interested, maybe I won't broadcast that, of someone who thinks weed is drugs and it's bad, but one drop of CBD and the boy goes from 30 seizures a day to 0. So, it's an interesting concept again, the nurturing aspect of the mother.
Most definitely, and I think even just that understanding of the spirituality around cannabis, Mary Jane, the way that it's described, even at the cabaret last night, I thoroughly enjoyed the reception that the Gunja fairies receive. There's so much femininity around cannabis, and I think it's really important that we celebrate that.
Great, we have another question here.
Hello.
Hi, I don't know. Hi, Rachel. It's Alyssa.
Hi, Alyssa. Hi.
So, for those that don't know me, I ran in the federal election as a federal candidate. So I ran as a face of the Legalise Cannabis Party in Victoria for the federal election. And we had over 250,000 Victorians vote for us in that election. And
Incredible.
I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of the fact that the women are standing up and showing their strength and showing that we can be articulate, we can still be loving, caring parents, and we can still look after our own health with intelligent choices. And we couldn't do that unless we had the ability to research and the ability to get that information out. So one thing that I'm interested in is there's really only a few products that are legally allowed to be sold as a cannabis or a CBD or especially the epilepsy in children. And we have this major stigma at the moment where if children have any chance of perceiving that we're using cannabis, that they're going to become traumatised and in the worst place, and we'll be terrible parents and terrible family members. What can we do to change that stigma? I know I work with the Tourette's Association, and we counsel parents who want to make more informed choices about how to have their children treated. which is great to see, but it's not publicised. There's nothing anywhere about the work that parents are doing in trying to advocate for their children's best health, or themselves as parents with Tourette's that are advocating and having to keep it secret how they're medicating to their children, because they might go to school and tell people that they're using a pipe for something, you know. So,
really, thanks, Alyssa. Really interesting question. And in a former life, I actually worked for the family court, and I would often see court cases coming before the court where they were deciding, you know, access for children to both mum and dad, and a drug test would always be included in that. And I often think this is just how little understanding there is within our criminal justice system, within our social justice system around parents that may consume cannabis, but you know, that understanding of it stays in your system for a long time. It doesn't necessarily make it mean that you're going to be under the effect of cannabis when you're parenting, and so forth. So I think it's also really important that, as you mentioned, research and looking at how much we are starting to understand the benefits of cannabis when it comes to children with epilepsy, when it comes to people with epilepsy more broadly, and so many other so many other ailments that people access cannabis for. I think that when it comes to how do we move forward through that, stigma is the major issue, but also the laws need to catch up. So regulating cannabis will be the next step forward in that. And also how we associate that impairment testing. Now, I know driving laws is sort of something where they're focusing on impairment, but I think more broadly that will come into conversation around workplace drug testing. It will probably also filter in through conversations around other mechanisms as well. But I think understanding more of how cannabis interacts with our bodies, how it interacts with our systems, and how we consume cannabis should be more of the wider conversation, and research supporting that.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I was going to say we are going to wind it up now, and thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for helping us be more mindful, and also bringing it back to like really real world issues and very serious ones why people are using cannabis, especially women.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Rachel. If you are interested in and women and cannabis, we have a session this afternoon on cannabis and pregnancy. So that's presented by Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather, who's come in from California and who is our first international guest post-COVID. So please come back for that particular session. That's at 2:15. Please stay. Next, we're going to shift gears completely. We've got rid of the politicians, got rid of the legal stuff. We're going to talk about some beautiful cannabis science, cultivation, genetics, what's going on in New Zealand and around the world. So hang out for Tom Forrest.